Okay, everyone. Today is the seventh week, continuing the seventh week of the semester. And today we start a new chapter in our study of machine learning. We start chapter 5 in our introduction to machine learning. And the topic is neural networks, okay, major topic in machine learning, which is the foundation for the revolution that is happening with deep learning. And of course, it's not like we don't know anything about neural networks so far. We've been doing logistic regression again and again, which incorporates many of the ideas that come into play in neural networks. In logistic regression, we took some inputs x1 through xm as input, and the goal was to find the weights w1 through wm to go along with those inputs. And you would take the weighted sum of all the values and subject it to a sigmoid function to provide a output, which could be 0, 1 output, or it could be generalized using softmax to the multi-class problem. With neural networks, we allow for those x's to be computed as features. So we no longer say that x's are the raw inputs you provide. What if we had a method for computing some features of those x's, phi of x? So we talked about that earlier on. Only thing is, in the past, phi of x was going to be something that the designer decided what the phi of x would be, feature of x would be. The designer would say, well, I'm going to use a radial basis function, for example. Whereas a neural network says, I'm going to build in that part. You supply the access to me, and I will compute a set of features, which we refer to as hidden units. Some hidden values are going to be computed, and that's what's going to be input to the final part, which is to do the classification. So that sounds promising, that the features are actually computed along the way. Of course, that's what a basic neural network does. It's got an input units, and then it's got what are called hidden units, and then it's got the output units. And a generalization of that network would be having, what about having several layers of hidden units? That becomes what's called as a deep network. It's got some more depth to it, layers and layers and layers and so on. And so those would be computing features, and then features of features and features of features of features and so on. So it has got some kind of a nested behavior in terms of what the features are. So that is the topic we are going to study. We'll begin with simple neural networks, which has got only one layer of hidden units, and try to understand it as well as possible, applying the same ideas that we have seen before to generalize it somewhat. But before studying this generally, we are going to also mention what's called as the biological motivation for neural networks. So we begin like that. Well, it is something that is nice to know. uh, it's not going to make a significant effect in your practice of machine learning, where you'll just go about implementing things. The fact that it came from a biological motivation may not be practically useful, but that is how things began. It is good to have a understanding of where these things came from, what the terminology is, and so on. And this is an age-old topic, neural networks coming from modeling, for example, the brain. So we're going to talk a little bit about modeling the brain. It's not like we are experts in medicine or physiology or something like that. But I think we need to have, first of all, why is it even called a neural network, right? Okay, neural network. Neural comes from neurons. What are neurons? If you look that up, neurons would be the neuron cells that are in the brain of a human being or any other creature would have some neurons to create some level of intelligence, right? And so that's where even the terminology neural network comes in. So it's worthwhile to have some sense for what this neuron is. And another reason to know about this motivation is future developments in machine learning, neural networks may again look back upon how the biological brain works and say, oh, okay, that's how it is. Maybe that's going to motivate us further to improve the methods even more. So this is all research tied in with practice. So we are not teaching in an introductory course just practice, right? In the sense, you have some application in mind. I just, I want to get some tools here, and that's all I need. It's not like you're taking a course on, Java or C++. Say, okay, just tell me what is how do I code in Java, or how do I code in C++? I will code whatever I want using that uh, set of tools that are available, libraries or what have you, and I'm going to write my code. One can regard machine learning as the same thing. Okay, you have a set of tools we give you, and you go away saying, I'll use those tools to write the code for doing machine learning. Here we are saying, now let's step back a little bit and even think about why these tools are there in the way they are. The reason is that in the future developments, we may actually be looking back again and inspiring us to do better on the kinds of tools that we have. So there are all these motivations. So we'll take a look at that part. Not too much. All right. I'm hoping to cover two things today. One is the biological motivation. I have to limit my time properly, because I could just go on and on for the entire lecture on the biological motivation. I hope it doesn't happen. It could happen today also. And we also have a section called feed-forward networks, where we look at the structure of these neural networks. Okay, let's see how it goes. Now, so in talking about the biological motivation for neural networks, we go back nearly 75 to 100 years. People have been wondering. This is one of the all-time goals of science, to understand how does the brain work. And so people have been exploring it and say, okay, maybe let's just look at an actual human brain and let us study it under a microscope, right? What does the brain consist of, that it does all this type of computation? And they found under a microscope that the human brain consists of what are called as cells, and these cells have a particular nature. They're the neuron cells. There are some names to all of these neuron cells. And the question is, how many cells does a human brain have, right? Anyone want to guess? How many neurons today does a human brain have? You can type into chat, right? How many neurons are there in your brain? All right, good. 1 trillion? No, not quite 1 trillion. That's more along the lines of how much money America owes to other countries. No, it's not 1 trillion. 10 billion is the right answer. Kurt Su got the correct answer. 10 billion. 700 billion. No, that might be a super bright person, right? A couple billion, 300 billion. Okay, 10 billion is the correct answer. So we got 10 billion in our human brain. Do you think a mosquito is smart? Have you had any dealings with mosquitoes? Right? Uh, Mosquito, okay, Daniel Walsh is familiar with mosquitoes. Do you think mosquitoes are smart? I mean, they're such a small creature. Uh, Well, you think of what all a mosquito can do. A mosquito can see, right? It can spot a person, or it can go and find a place to sit and all that, right? So And yeah, they know who tastes better in the dorms. Yeah, I've had the misfortune that when I've been in a group setting, they seem to always feed on me. So they have vision, they have eyes. If you look under a microscope, a mosquito, it's got eyes, it can see. And it also can, if you try to swat them, they go away. You must have noticed that also, right? If you have a fly swatter or something, it won't come near you for a while. If you try to swat it, goes away. It learns that this person is going to swat me, and it knows which one who tastes better. Um, I also actually I was so getting annoyed with mosquitoes over this last summer. I was reading up on it. It seems it's only the female mosquitoes that come and feed on you. The male mosquitoes only live on plants. The ones that are seeking human blood are the female mosquitoes. And anyway, anyway, that's irrelevant to this discussion. I then looked up. This is pretty smart. These mosquitoes. They must have some neurons. So then the question I'm going to ask you is, how many neurons does a mosquito brain have? Right? What do you think? You said 10 billion for the human brain. What about the mosquito brain? All right, I'm getting answers of 10,000, 50 million, 1 million, 500 million. Okay, all right. So these numbers are a bit off. There isn't a correct answer right there. Well, I did look it up, and the number of neurons in in a female mosquito is probably smarter than the male mosquito, which has to do all these things of foraging around, looking for human beings to bite. So it has got 100,000 neurons, 100,000 neurons, right? In India, 100,000 is referred to as 1 lakh, right? So it's 1 lakh or 100,000. So how many mosquitoes do you need to put together to create one human being in terms of the brain, right? We said is 10 billion is the human brain, and it is 100,000 for the mosquito. So how many mosquitoes are needed to make one human brain? I'm just asking you to make a quick calculation here. One is 10 to the 10 billion. 100,000, correct answer from Daniel Walsh. Okay. So we would need 100,000 mosquitoes to extract the number of neurons to create human. That doesn't seem all that large, It's kind of surprising that a mosquito has got that many, and so it's really 100,000. You need 100,000 mosquitoes, right? All right. Anyway, that is just a back of the envelope calculation, but it's useful to know how many neurons does a human brain have. It's 10 billion. So if you're going to create a neural network, how many parameters you need? Maybe you need 10 billion to create a human brain. That's quite a bit, quite a bit. The W, the W, the weight vector is going to be, you need 10 billion weights. So if you're talking about optimization in that space of W's of that large, right? Gradient descent in that kind of space. So these numbers are useful to know. All right. So as early as nearly 100 years ago, a couple of neuroscientists, they're called, McCulloch and Pitts were their two names. McCulloch and Pitts were the two scientists. I forget where they were. I think they were in the US. They looked under a microscope at the human brain, and they actually saw these neurons in under the microscope. And they say, oh, look, here are the neurons, so the cells. And then there are all these wires coming out of the neurons and connecting to other neurons. And they call those wires in our brain as dendrites. So we got some terminology here. We have actually there's a major wire coming out of each neuron called an axon. They called it an axon, and the axon splits itself into fine fibers called the dendrites. And the dendrites in turn touch the dendrites of other neurons, and there is communication between these neurons happening. And the strength of the connection between the dendrites, uh, the point of connections are called as synapses. So we'll take a look at these diagrams a little bit more. So there is the word, so the words here are axons and dendrites and synapses and so on. And actually, these all have meaning not only for us as machine learning AI people, but also the medical people. They also look at the brain, see what happens to someone who gets some neurological disorders such as Alzheimer's disease. And they say, the synaptic connection is weak, right? So they're not communicating with each other and so on. Anyway, there are all kinds of medical things one can talk about. So we are just interested in some of these numbers and what kind of connectivity. And the other thing McCulloch and Pitts noticed when they were looking at these things, they were actually probing them, putting some electrical probes into them. And they say these neurons actually fire, in the sense they send out a signal, a voltage, if you will, for a short period of time. It travels along the neuron, along the axon, and goes and triggers the next one. And they notice that it triggers something when all the inputs coming to it from the various dendrites, some of them are excitatory inputs, coming from other neurons, other cells. It could be from the human eye, for example, or it could be coming from another neuron. And some of them are excitatory inputs, and then some of them are inhibitory inputs. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative, and they all somehow get weighted and added up. And if that weight exceeds some threshold, then it fires to the next one. So that is how the excitation happens between the neurons. So that's interesting. So they made that observation among these voltages. And they also found that the time it takes for these neurons to accumulate the information and fire would take something like 10 to the minus 3 seconds, right? It takes some amount of time for that to happen. So we can refer to that as switching time. How long does it take for it to switch? That is, to send out a signal or not send out a signal, and so on. So that also becomes a factor, saying, okay, so that is how much it takes. Even for one neuron, it takes that much time. Then if you talk about, lots of neurons working together. So, I mean, if it is sequential, that's going to take a lot of time, one after the other. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of billions of neurons. And they also observed that human beings don't take, you know, apparently we can recognize people very quickly, particularly if you're familiar people, like, let's say your mother. Let's say, people are all able to recognize their mother very quickly. And so how long does it take? Or your grandmother, right? You recognize them. And that takes 10 to the minus 1 second. Switching time is 10 to the minus 3. So, okay, it's possible to recognize your mother or grandmother by a sequence of switchings, but that's far too many neurons need to be in place. So it can't be just a sequential type of thing. There is some parallelism going on. It's not just like one after the other that's happening, but it's a whole thing's working simultaneously, which is called as a distributed architecture. So this leads us to the concept of neurons and connections and firings and distributed processing. So all of these ideas come into play when we talk about the design of, we can refer to them as artificial neural networks. For a long time, we used to call them as ANNs. In my earlier work, my students were working on these topics 15, 20 years ago or so. We used to just refer to them as ANN. I'm using an ANN. What is an ANN? Artificial neural network. We don't hear the terminology anymore. We refer to it as deep networks, right? That's what they call today, deep networks. several layers and so on. And we decide to do away with the neural, even saying, okay, fine, it came from neurals, but these are just computational methods with deep networks. So anyway, these are all some of the things that a biological motivation for a neural network is. And so that's what my first set of slides 5.0 is going to be about, is biological motivation. And in my slides, I have three parts to it. Uh, okay, in my overview slide there, we have a picture of McCulloch and Pitts, who are the original guys who were studying the brain and got an inspiration that this consists of some kind of a neural network, some connectivity between neurons and their firing and so on. These are like neurobiologists who came up with that. And then a lot of machine learning also derives its inspiration from statistical physics. The things we've been looking at in terms of the Bernoulli distribution and the binomial distribution, and we're modeling things statistically, and there are more complex statistical modeling that goes on in machine learning. When we get into Markov networks, we talk about things like Boltzmann machines. And Boltzmann was a physics guy. He was modeling statistical physics. And he was talking about gases and how the various measures of pressure, volume, things like that are all statistical in nature and depends on the interaction between the atoms and so on. All of that modeled statistically. So it turns out that some of the machine learning models we study are based on Boltzmann machines type of mathematics. And there was also another mathematician called Hosea Gibbs, who was also studying the statistics of gases and so on. And from him came methods of sampling of statistical distributions called Gibbs sampling and so on. So machine learning is a combination of things in three topics. One is the biological motivation done by one group of people, long ago, 100 years ago. And then this Boltzmann, Gibbs, that's also 100 years ago, physics. And then came distributed computing, where we say, we can do all of this with neural networks, parallel architectures, and distributed computing, and so on. That comes to the modern era, which leads all the way to GPUs and so on. So that is the third area. So this whole area is a combination of three different areas. So we look at pictures of some of these for fun. And anyway, I think it's worthwhile to keep that in mind, where all this came from, so that you can look back and have a fuller understanding of what is machine learning. After all, there's a course on introductory machine learning, right? Okay. All right, I used up a lot of my time. I think maybe I'll just be able to do the biological motivation only. Let's see how it goes. Okay. All right, I'll go over these slides a bit fast. There is really no math involved or anything here. It's just a kind of a descriptive thing, and I've already told you what it is. So we begin by saying there are two types of neural network research. Okay, I didn't mention this quite. It says, there are researchers who work on, neural computing. And if you ask them, what do you do? Well, I'm studying and modeling biological learning. I'm more interested in figuring out how does the biological brain work? How does the mosquito learn how to attack certain people and find people to attack and all kinds of things, right? Hide to hide and whatnot. And how does that work? Network of neurons in the brain provide people with ability to assimilate information And if we simulate such things on the computer, will it reveal the underlying mechanism of learning? So maybe we want to do it on the computer, but only from the point of view of learning how the brain works, how the neurons work, and how the biological brain works. But most of the motivation for machine learning is not from a biological research perspective, but to obtain highly effective learning machines. We argued earlier on, maybe I presented in the beginning, that the old methods of artificial intelligence based on programming it using logic rules and all that was infeasible. And the best way to do it is to replace it by having machines that learn based on examples. Rather than you're telling how the code is written, it figures out, what it needs to be done. And we don't really care about biological realism because it imposes unnecessary constraints. Actually, the human brain is analog computing, not even digital computing. It's like all these voltages going along these axons, and their pulses are not even exactly digital pulse, but a spike or something like that. And so those are all, we don't necessarily try to model all of that. Let's leave it to the study of biological learning. So we want highly effective learning machines. Primarily the multi-layer perceptrons. We saw the perceptron and multi-layer, that is, features should be computed also. All right, here is my slide showing all these people, inspiring people which led to where we are today. On the top left is an extracted human brain, the kind of human brain that was studied by Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts. These are the guys who studied what the brain consists of, and they said, "Oh, it's got a whole bunch of neurons in it, and they're all connected to each other, and that's how the brain looks like." And then the statistical physics I mentioned, these were guys who were just studying, physics, nature of gases and temperature and volume and pressure and all these things. Ludwig Boltzmann, who was interested in thermodynamics, and Hosea Gibbs, who was also interested in the statistical physics things. And today, machine learning is named after these guys. Neural networks are deriving from these guys, but we use those same ideas over here whenever we use probability distributions to compute outputs and so on. And things like Boltzmann machines and so on, they come from there. And of course, today we are interested in doing all these computations using parallel architectures or distributed computing. This is an architecture here of what's called a convolutional neural network. And Mihir just told me that you're going to be implementing CNNs on project number 2. This is the kind of architecture, which is convolutional layers and pooling layers and things like that, soft max at the output and so on. And the guys who did a lot of basic work, for example, the deep learning, in deep learning, were these guys who won the Turing Award last year. Jan LeCun, Jeffrey Hinton, and Yoshua Bengio. And Jeffrey Hinton is the one who primarily came up with the backpropagation method, which is the primary engine, the stochastic gradient descent and all that comes from that. And Jan LeCun is the guy who came up with it's convolutional neural networks. We pass a kernel around and you multiply all the values. So you're sharing parameters and so on. And Yoshua Bengio has done a lot of work on the deep learning methods and so on. So anyway, these are the underpinnings. Anyways, so this set of slides is mostly about neural computation, the first part about the brain. So study of neural computation, inspired by the observation, biological learning systems are built of very complex webs of interconnected neurons. Each unit takes real valued inputs, possibly from other units, and produces a single real valued output, which becomes the input to many other units. Okay, many inputs coming in and produce one output, it could go to other units. Well, this is what the brain looks like when you put it under a scanning electron microscope of brain tissue. Wow, look at this here. What a web it is, huh? And eh, basically, maybe this thing is the neuron nucleus of the neuron here. And there are all these other axons going out here, right? Axons going out. And then there are all these dendrites coming in and touching this cell here. All kind of complicated connections. It's not a very simply describable. Okay, so this is what a colored scanning electron micrograph looks like. So basically, these inputs come in positive, negative, and so on. The neuron then fires along its axon. And maybe the same thing goes around along each axon. I don't know. Probably the same thing goes around. When it gets excited, it sends out a signal. And that again gets passed on to other neurons. And there are how many of these? 10 billion of these in the human brain. So here is a schematic diagram. Somebody tried to draw a diagram saying this is the body schematic diagram of a neuron body. This is the axon, and this is going on and on. And then these are the ends here are called the dendrites. So this is axon. Direction of passage of impulse, and impulse is going out to these. Maybe it doesn't go out to all of these. Maybe these just receive things perhaps. These are the ones how it gives the outputs here. And there are all kinds of, this is a pretty sophisticated terminology of studying the human brain. And we have primary dendrites, axon hillock. Okay, that looked like a hillock, all right. Axon hillock here. This is an axon here. They're called spiny dendrites. All right. This is the forebrain. Okay, this also differs on which part of the brain you're talking about. Forebrain, the front of the brain, cortex. Right, some name, cortex Golgi. And then there is a perikaryon, cell body of a neuron containing the nucleus. Perikaryon. Okay, so anyway, fascinating topic. All of this doesn't matter to computer guys too much, but anyway, that's where it all came from. Neuron nucleus contained in the soma or body of the cell. The neuron nucleus is contained in the soma. Here's the body of the cell. This is called the neuron nucleus over here. So I guess that neuron, that body is referred to as the perikaryon. All right. So more than 10 billion neurons in the human brain. I guess there could be smart people maybe have more than 10 billion neurons. All right. I also heard that every time you take a beer, let's say, you drink a can of beer, there goes 100 neurons, right? You probably kill off 100 neurons. But 100 out of 10 billion is a small number. So it doesn't matter. So you can kill off some neurons by doing bad things like that. All right. Or maybe it's healthy for them. Who knows, right? Maybe that's a joke about how many neurons are killed every time you indulge. Okay, mosquito has 100,000 neurons, right? That's one I had to look up. I was so annoyed with mosquitoes that I had to look up. I said, how can they be so smart? They have 100,000 neurons to perform vision. What else they do? They do perform vision, right? They can see, they can go and eat and whatnot. Even for bodily functions, they would need some neurons. Implies human is 100,000 mosquitoes. All right. Okay, so that's all. So we are just equal to 100,000 mosquitoes. Switching time. Human brain is a densely connected network of 10 to the 11. Oh, wow. This number has suddenly increased to 100 billion neurons. All right. I said 10 billion, and now I'm talking about 100 billion. All right. So maybe it's even more than 10 billion, 100 billion. How many are they connected? Each neuron is connected to 10,000 others. That's interesting. So one can be connected to 10,000 other neurons. It's in 3 dimensions, right? It's not like just on the surface of the brain. It can also be inside the brain and all that. And the fastest neuron switching time is 10 to the minus 3 seconds. How long does it take to accept inputs and fire? And activity is excited or inhibited through connections to other neurons. And it is slow compared to computer switching speed, which is 10 to the minus 10 seconds. Right. So how fast does a switch in the integrated circuit take, right? In the sense, when you apply an input to a diode or a transistor, how long does it take to provide the output for a transistor, for a basic element of memory? It takes 10 to the minus 10 seconds, much faster than the fastest neuron in our brain. So humans can make certain decisions in 10 to the minus 1 seconds. So I guess it can be measured. Visually recognizing a familiar object, recognize your mother or something, 10 to the minus 1 second. Implies that in 10 to the minus 1 second interval cannot possibly have more than a few hundred steps given switching speed. 10 to the minus 3 is what it takes for switching speed. Then you cannot have more than 100 steps. So that is actually a small amount of computation. Therefore, information processing abilities of biological systems follow from highly parallel processing operations distributed over many neurons. So this is saying the sense of our computation in our brain comes from parallel computing. And that is because it cannot be one after the other after the other. You see the logical flow of a sequential code when you write a Java program or a C++ program, that is sequentially written code. Whereas that would be symbolic processing one after the other and so on. Whereas this is going on simultaneously. And that is the essence of how the human brain performs, which motivates us to have computational methods that are like that. So this is a very rich topic, neurophysiology. We have stimuli from the environment. So the inputs may be coming from the environment, like the human eye, or the ear, or the touch. So we have the receptors, and then we have the nervous system proper, and then we have the effectors, responses to the environment. So the nervous system consists of a 3-stage system. So they model it in this way. What are these receptors? These are rods and cones of eyes. I suppose we're talking about some specialized cells in the eyes. Pain, touch, hot and cold receptors of the skin, and the stretch receptors of the muscles. And the effects are muscles and glands and speech generators and so on. So in a way, this is describing a biological system that works. So neurobiology again, basic morphology, these connections and so on of neurons, including axons, dendrites, cell bodies or somata and synapses. So that's what neurobiology is about. And chemical transmitters at synapses, where things touch, and how connection of nerve impulses is affected by the actions of various ions in and around the cells. See, it's all, they refer to it as wetware sometimes. This is all about solutions and liquids and so on. And these are ions around the cells. This is an old, over the year, I've been teaching this course for many years now. So over the years, I've been collecting some interesting images that come along. This was the one I've had about 20 years ago from a Scientific American article. This was what I had seen, what the brain looked like. I showed you a better diagram earlier on. This one is again another view, which is still worth looking at. You see there is how we got a body of the neuron here and then nucleus inside it. And then there are things like the axons and dendrites. It's another view. I guess maybe they just took a thin layer of the brain and flattened it out and took a microscope photograph of it, and this is what it looks like, the cerebral cortex. We saw this diagram again. I have used it before. Dendrites form a fine filamentary bush, each fiber thinner than an axon. So there are all these fibers here. Axon, long thin cylinder carrying impulses from soma to other cells and splits into end bulbs almost touching dendrites. Place of near contact is a synapse. Okay, so anyways, a lot of detail to this. Interneuronal transmission. Impulses reaching a synapse set up graded electrical signals in the dendrites of neurons on which synapse impinges. Interneuronal transmission. Okay, how is the transmission happening between one neuron and the other? It's sometimes electrical, usually by diffusion of chemical transmitters. So there is some chemistry going on, and there is also electrical things going on. Okay. Oh, okay, a lot more detail. Do we want to learn more about synapses? When a spike travels along an axon and arrives at a synapse, it causes vesicles of transmitter chemical to be released. There are several kinds of transmitters. The transmitter molecules diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bind to receptor molecules in the membrane of the postsynaptic neurons, thus changing their shape. This opens up holes that allow specific ions in or out. The effectiveness of the synapse can be changed, vary the number of vesicles of transmitter, vary the number of receptor molecules. Synapses are slow, but they have advantages over random access memory. They're very small, they adapt using locally available signals. But how? Anyway, these are all stuff you can read. I'm just giving you a pointer that this is a pretty rich, nice topic. There's more on the chemical synapses. Transmitting neuron or presynaptic cell liberates transmitter substance that diffuses across synaptic junction. People say that thinking can make you tired, right? Right? You're saying, no, what is this? You're not doing any physical work, and physical work, of course, makes you tired. But all you've been doing is thinking and trying to understand, machine learning, and how could that make you tired? Well, look at all that's going on in the brain. We are liberating transmitter substance that diffuses across synaptic junction, electrical signal converted to chemical signals, changes postsynaptic cell membrane potential, chemical signal converted back to electrical signals. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff happening in the brain, which is why thinking also can be tiresome, not just physical work. And what is this nerve impulse waveform? Look at this. This is over a period of time, milliseconds, as appears on an oscilloscope by placing microelectrode near an axon. It's an action potential. All are non-electrical potential that travel a meter or more and trigger electrochemical coupling. So this is going along. Membrane potential voltage, this is millivolts or microvolts inside versus outside of membrane. Right, so they're measuring these things, the voltages going along. A neuron will only fire an electrical impulse along its axon only if sufficient impulses reach end bulbs impinging on its dendrites in a short period of time called period of latent summation. All right, they could be coming at different points of time, and if they're given a short period of time, it should all add up. Impulses may help or hinder firing of impulses. So they can help or hinder. Excitation should exceed inhibition by critical amount called threshold of the neuron. And a neuron fires only if the total weight of the synapses that receive impulses in the period of latent summation exceeds the threshold, which you already said that. So what do people in this area, neural computation, maybe you will get excited enough on this topic and want to do neural computation. So what do they do to understand how the brain actually works? That it's big and very complicated and made of yucky stuff that dies when you poke it around. All right, very technical terminology here. That things can die if you poke around with it. and to understand a new style of computation inspired by neurons and their adaptive connections, and very different style from sequential computation. We just said that it's parallel computation. Should be good for things that brains are good at. Example, vision. Our human eye is very good in detecting things and so on. And that's going to require these neurons. Should be bad for things that brains are bad at. All right. Example, okay, how much is 23 times 71? Right. And, the normally we are not good at this kind of a thing that requires some kind of sequential computation, doing multiplication and so on. Uh, so these neural networks are kind of simulating things we are good at, which kind of brings us to the point of what is artificial general intelligence. For a long time, computers have been made to be very smart to do things like playing chess and things that we find are hard at. These are just hard to become a good chess player, or maybe to become a good player of Go. Those kinds of things we've been able to program computers that brains are bad at, and those all involved symbolic computation. But things we are good at are things like walking around and finding our way through a classroom, or right, recognizing friends or recognizing your mother or whatnot, right? Those kinds of things we are good at. Brains are good at that. Vision we are good at. So these neural networks are what is needed for solving AI problems that are easy for human beings. But those are the things that are hard using conventional knowledge-based type of methods. So it seems to be the right solution to solve things that people find, like driving a car, right? They're finding it so hard to program a autonomous vehicle. Even today, Tesla is saying I just read that today in the paper that Tesla is making available more autonomous software to people who own their car. But they're leaving all the liability to the owners. It's up to you. You can use our software to run your car around on its own, but if you get into an accident, we are not responsible. Okay. All right. Anyway, so the point I'm making here is the computers have been good at doing things that are hard for the brain, but they have not done well on things that are easy for the brain. And it seems like the neural networks are the solution to that kind of problems, which is brain-like. And to solve practical problems by using novel learning algorithms. Learning algorithms can be very useful even if nothing to do how the brain works. Okay. This is also from that 30-year-old Scientific American article. They were trying to explain what did McCulloch and Pitts do? This is what they found. They said that neuron takes a sum, and these are all the impulses coming in. Input activity is this: a small pulse, a tall one, a tiny one, and a tall one coming in. But there are weights here. These are the weights of the network, and we multiply that. Okay, by times 2 means it becomes double. Times 0.1 means that's almost neglected. 0.5 means it's one half of it. 3 times is 3 times the input size. 1 is just pass it along. And this is just summing all the inputs. And here is the total weighted input. And the input output function. So here is the total weighted input, some kind of mapping. This is usually our sigmoid. This is the W transpose X is what is here. These are all the W's and these are the X's. We multiply the X vector by the W vector, get W transpose X, which is the sum of all of which is scalar value. That this is W transpose X. And we input W transpose X to the sigmoid function. And that's going to, this is a multi-class in this case, not, maybe this is an answer where they seem to be all the same height. Maybe it's like 0.3, 0.3, 0.3, 3.33, 0.33, 0.33, adding up to 1. And by the softmax function for the multi-class case, the two-class case would be just sigmoid off, right? Otherwise, we'd have to use exponential input divided by summation exponential or all that to get the softmax here. So anyway, this kind of gives you another way of looking at what the brain does. The brain is only sending out voltage pulses here. It's not sending out a number as such. That is how the signal is coming in. ANN, this is the old terminology. Artificial neural networks are built of densely connected set of simple units. Each unit takes several real valued inputs, produce single valued output. This is what a common artificial neural network looks like. Again, this was well before the dawn of deep learning. Um, you know, my slides go back to like 30 years ago when I said, okay, here's a nice diagram in the Scientific American article. Let me use it in my class. And so some of them are still useful, as you can see. And okay. So one motivation is to capture highly parallel computation on distributed processes, and most ANN software run on sequential machines. This was well before the dawn of GPUs. And we just had conventional CPUs, and we were running on sequential machines emulating distributed processing. So we used to use something called the Stuttgart Neural Network Simulator. SNNS was a nice package that would behave like a neural network, but was also just running on a ordinary sequential computer. So neural networks are used to learn functions that are real valued, discrete valued, vector valued. We know all this. Limitations of neural networks need substantial number of training samples. So I guess that's true. Slow learning convergence times, inadequate parameter selections that can lead to poor minima. We no longer worry about this poor minima. We says we can always get a good gradient descent solution. Uh, Three mechanisms of convolution. Okay, we are kind of jumping into convolutional neural networks here. That's okay because you're implementing it anyhow. We have local receptive field, subsampling, weight sharing, and this is an old diagram which kind of treats these ideas. Input image is this plane here, and we have 5 by 5 groups being mapped into one value here. And each pixel patch is 5 by 5, we say. So this is basically the idea of convolution. And that is repeated again and again and again. They're overlapping. When you move it over, it's overlapping here. That gives you the next value and so on. And this might create a smaller image. This plane has a 10 by 10, 100 neural network units called a feature map. These are referred to as a feature map. And that again is subsampled. For example, this 2 by 2 unit is replaced by a single value. Don't take all the 2 by 2, that's 4 values. Replace it by one value, which could be the maximum of all the values there. That's called max pooling, right? That's the most common one, max pooling. In those days, this diagram again is a historical diagram that is part of my slides. We used to call it a subsampling. Today, they don't call it a subsampling, they call it as pooling. So we are pooling all of this into one. But it's the same thing as subsampling is take all these values and I guess pooling is a better term because that tells you that you pool all the values and get a single value. Subsampling somehow seems to say sample then use one of them or something, right? Not necessarily that way. So this is a convolution. This is my last slide on the biological motivation. It says, see, convolutional neural network is inspired by visual neuroscience. Why that convolution again comes into play? Why are you doing that in terms of passing along the kernel? But that seems to be how the brain works. So the brain example still is useful. Look at this classic notion, simple cells and complex cells. So apparently we have simple cells and complex cells. And the architecture is similar to, well, this is again brain stuff. And this is similar to the brain people will tell you that there is an LGN, B1, B2, V4, IT hierarchy in visual cortex ventral pathway. This is again a view of the human brain. The primary visual cortex, here's the eye, the two eyeballs. Optic nerve, something called optic chasm here. and then optic tract here, lateral geniculate nucleus here. There is an optic radiation, and then primary. This is the cortex. That's the brain actually. And I guess here is a three-dimensional view again. And it is this thing, lateral geniculate nucleus is referred to as LGN. That's this LGN over here. And then there are these things, V1, V2. And I guess they come again. There are several diagrams here. One is this cross-sectional view. This is a three-dimensional view. This is the retina and the eye over here. All right. So I guess the eye is over here. And we have V1, V2 coming, primary visual cortex. I suppose these are the V1 and V2 here, V1, V2. There's also a V4 over here. And then there is an IT over here. All right, it's called the inferotemporal cortex. That's called the IT. LGN, lateral geniculate nucleus. Visual cortex 1, visual cortex 2, visual cortex 4, and the inferotemporal cortex. So that is over here. So V1, V2 are the primary visual cortex. This is kind of showing you again this pathway in a schematic diagram. Retina to LGN, LGN to V1, V1 to V2, V2 interacts with V4 and V3. And then there is this something else here. I guess we have inferotemporal cortex is this part, IT, which has got subparts TO and TE. So the biology guys say this is how these things work. There are 30 areas of the visual cortex. Wow, look at this. The back of our brain is where all the visual stuff is being processed. And V1 and V2 are the principal ones. And so anyway, these guys studied all this and said, well, what happens is the full image comes in and you can't be passing along the entire image all the way to the back. There is some kind of convolution going on. We reduce the amount of information, analogous to the convolutional operation and pooling operation and so on. And so there are all these things operating on it. And the final, I guess, the final part is what? In every neural network, we've got the softmax, right? Which is the one that maps your input into the output, which is probably this IT, inferotemporal cortex, performs the actual object recognition. So there is some analogy here between the deep learning network and what the human brain does, right? So there is really no deep mathematical stuff here that we did, but it motivates why we are using the model. Where did this come from? And proceed from there. Let's see, how are we doing, Mihir? Okay.
So we can start with the breakout questions now.
All right. So I will leave it to Mihir. I think he's going to go back to the previous lecture, which is not today's lecture. Today's was all about the brain. You know, sometimes it's nice to talk about something other than all these equations and the math. But I think it motivates your math when you know that this is what it works, this is what we're trying to do, saying, okay, it's hard stuff. That's why we're doing all this math. Okay. All right, then so we just finished 5.0. So we do 5.1 next week. So we're going to be on neural networks for a few weeks. Okay. All right, I'm going to close this part. And